So today I would like to show you why the ADDR sequencer from Bog Audio is such a great module and why I use it all the time for so many years. It was released already back in 2019, so it's about 6 years old already, but still such a great little sequencer. I know I have a couple of short videos about it already, but it's about time to make a dedicated video. So as you can see, we have by default 8 steps. In the right-click menu, we can change the range of the sequence. Right, of course, we have a clock input, a reset input, and we have one output. Right, here I have it sequencing the pitch of an FM operator, right, through a quantizer. And again, by default, we have 8 steps, but of course we can have shorter sequences, but also longer sequences with the expander, right? There is the ASX module, which is the expander for the ADDR sequencer, and it will add 8 more steps. So now instead of 8 steps, we have 16. But of course, we can have also everything in between. So in this case, I will go with 10 steps, change the steps here, the values. Right, so now again, instead of 8 steps, we have 10 steps thanks to the expander. And of course, we can add also multiple expanders. So here I have 2 sets, right? I have the main module and I have 3 more expanders. So we have all in all 32 steps. I'm using one to sequence the pitch of an FM voice and another one to sequence the FM amount, right? You can sequence all sorts of things with it, not just pitch. Right, so in this case I have 2 sequences of 32 steps. So it's really easy to create also longer sequences, and you can also add rests and control note length by sequencing the ADDR externally. Right, so here I have 64 steps, right? You can see with multiple expanders, so you can add more expanders and have even longer sequences. This is sequencing the pitch of the XCO from the same collection. But here, instead of using a clock module to clock the ADDR, I'm using the nibble sequencer, which is a trigger sequencer. So we get also rests and the sequence is not always running. Now by default, the ADDR sequencer will run forward, but we have a switch also to reverse the sequence, right? So now it will run in reverse. And we can also do this externally with an inverted or negative clock. In the right-click menu, we have reverse step on negative clock. Right, so now if I invert the clock, in this case the LFO, the sequence will run in reverse. With this LFO, it's quite easy. I just have to offset it down. Right, you can see now it's inverted and now the ADDR runs in reverse. Right, again, positive clock, it will run forward, and negative clock, it will run in reverse. So this is a great way of adding variation to even short sequences. Here I have a simple 8-step sequence, in this case sequencing the editator from the same collection from Bog Audio. Right, again, a simple 8-step sequence. But now I can mix, for example, a clock division of 5 that I have here, right, and I will mix it in not positive but negative, so we get now a different variation of the sequence. Right, you can see it runs forward, it runs in reverse with the negative clock, so we have a different sequence. I will add some delay to this just for fun, maybe the delay from Musex. Right, and we can also do this by mixing trigger sequences. Right, here I'm using 3 sequences with a trigger sequencer from Count Modular. I have here once an 8-step sequence, and then I have here 7 steps and 5 steps, and they are inverted here on the mixer. Right, so on these steps, the sequence, the ADDR will run in reverse, and we have a bit more variation. The voice in this case is the LVCO, again from the same collection. So again, even though we have a so-called simple 8-step sequence, we have more variation with it by using negative clocks or negative triggers. I have some weird drums here. I'm using the tremor too and sequencing all sorts of different things. The decay, the shape, the noise with 4 ADDR sequencers. The ADDR sequencer is not called ADDR or addressed sequencer for nothing. Another great feature it has is the select function. It allows us to scan through the steps in various ways, right? So if again I use a clock, in this case from an LFO to clock it, right, it will run like any other sequencer. It will run forward. Right, we get basically a normal sequence, but instead of the clock, I can use, for example, a saw wave to scan through the steps. So I can use, maybe I will show you this also on the scope. This will be the blue trace. Right, the saw wave will go to the select input. Right, and now it scans through the steps. You can see this on the scope. You can see this also on the sequencer itself. Right, in the shape of a saw wave, it will go forward and then it will jump back to the beginning, to step 1. Right, but if I use a different shape, for example, a triangle wave, right, you can see now it goes forward and then goes back, right, just like a triangle goes up and down. You can see this again on the scope, right, we have a sort of a ping-pong movement back and forth. Right, so we can use all sorts of different shapes to scan through the sequence. Here I have a triangle LFO from the LLFO, again from the same collection. This will scan through the sequence. I have here the FM operator as my voice. Right, so again we get a sort of a ping-pong-like movement back and forth. But I'm sending this LFO first through a wave folder, so I can shape the LFO and get something much more complex. Right, you can see this on the scope, you can hear it, and also you can see this on the sequencer itself. Right, it goes up, it goes down a bit. Right, now it's also possible to sync this with a clock. So again, in the right-click menu of the ADDR, we have the select on clock mode. If I activate this, you see now we don't get any sequence because the ADDR is waiting for a clock and it will select the steps only with an incoming clock or trigger. So I will use a multiplied by 2 clock. Right, so we get still the same movement, right? The folded LFO will dictate the movement of the sequence, but it will happen only together with the clock. Again, I will add some delay to this. And this works nicely also with random sources. So here I'm using walk, and you can see it outputs a smooth random signal. Right, so this scans through the sequence, and again I'm using a clock to sync this movement. Right, so it happens only together with the clock. In this case, the voice that I'm using is the kick all here as a bass. Right, so again, the movement is still very much random. It will randomly scan through the 8-step sequence, but it will happen only together with the clock. Now, there are also a few modules from Doc B that works really nicely with the ADDR. Right here I have a 16-step sequence with one expander sequencing the XCO. I'm using here also the PEC6, which is a filter bank, again from the same collection. Such an incredible collection. I'm going to solo this for a second. Right, so again, in this case, we have a simple 16-step sequence, and I'm using here the P16 from Doc B to scan through the sequence, and you can see the shape it has now is basically just like a stepped saw wave, so it will scan through the sequence from 1 to 16, but it has different patterns here that we can choose from, so different movements. Right, you can see this here, but also on the sequence itself. Right, so we can have different patterns and by that different sequences. I have here also some hi-hats using a clock multiplier, R gate, again from the same collection with some noise, a filter. There's another interesting use of the select input. Here I have it set to 4 steps, so it will play step 1, 2, 3, and 4, but I can also select on which step this 4-step sequence will start at, right? If I unmute this, now it's again 1, 2, 3, 4. If I set this to step 2, or select to step 2, now we have 2, 3, 4, 5. Again, it's a 4-step sequence, but it will start from step 2 and so on and so forth, right? If it starts from step 5, we have 5, 6, 7, 8. Right, so like this we can create variation. Now if I change this, right, you can hear we have glitches. Also here, the select on clock can help you. It will quantize changes to the clock. Right, so now we don't have glitches if you do this manually or also with CV input. And again, we can use also external sequences to do this for us. Here I have another ADDR that it will sequence the select. Right, so now we have variation. We always have a 4-step sequence, but the starting point will change. There's another mode for this that I would like to show you later on, but for now, here, for example, I have a 7-step sequence. Right, we'll play 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. The voice itself here is the VCO from the same collection with a low-pass gate. Right, so again, we have a 7-step sequence, but you can see I'm using here an expander, even though it's just 7 steps. I'm going to move these 7 steps around, so I have 16 steps to choose from. Right, I can have these 7 steps starting anywhere inside the 16 steps. And to set a starting point, I'm going to use again another ADDR sequencer. Right, so again, we still have 7 steps. But they will always start from a different point. Also here we'll add some delay to this just for fun. And again, there's another mode I would like to show you. Here I have a 5-step sequence. Right, again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 with an FM voice, 2 FM operators. Now in the right-click menu, again of the ADDR sequencer, we have triggered select mode, so I'm going to activate this. This means that with each trigger at the select input, the first step will advance once. Right, so here for example, I set this now to 2. You can see nothing happens because it expects a trigger at the CV input. I'm going to use a clock division of 5, and now with each trigger, right, it will move 1 step, so it will play once 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it will play 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then it will go back to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth, because we have it set to 2. If I have this set to 4, right, it will play 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 5, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Right, it will move always 1 trigger, in this case 4 times, until it starts all over again. So it's really easy to add variation even when using shorter sequences. I have here also a bass, again with a key call here, and I'm using 1 sequencer to sequence pitch and 2 more sequencers to sequence modulation, shape and decay. And you can see also here I'm not using a dedicated clock to clock the ADDR sequencer. I'm using another trigger sequencer So I get also variation in note length and rests. And I have here also some drums with the gate sequencer from Impromptu and different drum voices with plats. Another interesting feature of the ADDR sequencer is the fact that it's polyphonic, which means that you can drive it with a polyphonic clock, for example, and have multiple sequences running at the same time with just one sequencer. So here I have a 5-step sequence, again sequencing the FM operator. Right, but now I can merge a few clock divisions and get multiple sequences polyphonically. So this main clock that I'm using will go to the VCV merge module, so I can merge a few signals into a polyphonic signal. This will go back to the clock input, and now for example I can add a divided by 3 clock. Already we have 2 sequences. You can see this also here. We have 2 lights right on the sequence, and you can hear it that we have 2 voices. I can add another clock division of 5, so we have 3 voices. And even a divided by 7 clock, and even let it run in reverse. So one sequence can run backward. Again, with a negative clock, I have this on here in the right click menu, reverse step on negative clock. So I will take the clock division of 7, let's say, invert it, and then send this to the merge module. So we have 4 channels all in all, 4 channels of polyphony, 4 voices. Right, I will add some delay to this. And this works great also with multiple trigger sources. Right here, for example, I have 4 trigger sequences, again with the trigger sequencer from Count Modula, 8 steps, 7 steps, 6 steps, and 5 steps. And I have also a trigger with probability. I'm using chances, again Count Modula, to add probability to an incoming clock. So we have 5 channels all in all. We have 5 sequences, 5 voices. We have polyphony of 5 channels. This is sequencing the VCO from the same collection, going through Nimbus, which is a Clouds clone, and a delay. Now we can also use the select input polyphonically, right? Not just the clock input, but also the select. Here I have the 4FO, again from the same collection. I'm also feedback modulating it, so there are all sorts of different shapes here going on. Now in the right click menu of the ADDR sequencer, we can choose where to get the polyphony from, right? Polyphony channels from. In this case, I have the select input. So if you have a polyphonic signal in the CV input of the select, the ADDR will also become polyphonic, right? So this is exactly what I'm doing here with 4 different LFOs, sequencing the XCO. Get nice chords in this case. Right, this just needs a nice bass drone. I'm mixing here a few LVCOs, again from the same collection, a chorus, a filter, a delay. As a bonus, if you want to experiment with a sequencer that has similar features, you can try the PGMR sequencer, again from the same collection. In this case, we have 4 rows we can use. It also has an expander that you can add to have longer sequences, and it has also many of the other features of the ADDR sequencer. So here, for example, I'm using a switch, again from the same collection, to switch between 2 rows, once for pitch and once for modulation. This voice itself is the FM operator going through some delay. Right, so again we have 4 rows we can use. And also here we have the triggered select mode, but here it works a bit differently, which is also quite interesting. Right, in this case, again, I have it on in the right-click menu, triggered select mode. Right, but now, in this case, we can combine another clock via the select input. Right, so I have here a faster clock with probability that I can use. Let me unmute this already, this is kick all. Right, so via the select input, I can now combine the second clock with probability. Right, and we have something a bit more interesting. And of course, also this will work with a phaser or something to scan through the sequence. Right here again, I'm using the P16 from dock B, but I'm using another ADDR sequencer to sequence the patterns, right? So we have different patterns that creates variation in the sequence. I have here the XCO as my voice. Right, with a bandpass filter and some delay. Right, and again we can scan through the sequence through the select input. I have here also some chords. In this case I'm combining the 4 rows into 4 channels of polyphony. Right, sequencing again the LVCO, and there are more features to explore with the PGMR. It really is an interesting sequencer. But that was it for today. Thank you again so much for watching. Cheers!